Statham stood at the bus stop, watching the constant flow of cars that never stopped, even at this late hour of the evening. The city never slept. Its streets were always filled with noise, movement, and light. Statham, of course, was used to it, but today he felt a certain emptiness. Despite his success in business, despite all he had achieved, he felt tired and lost. Something important was missing, and he couldn't figure out what it was. He decided to take a walk through a few blocks to clear his mind. As he left the building where his office was, he saw a familiar sight. A homeless man sitting by the entrance to an old store covered by a blanket, with an outstretched hand, searching for some spare change. It was George, a middle-aged man with a flushed face and gray eyes that once held hope but now seemed dull. Statham knew him. From time to time, he passed by George, but always avoided his gaze, or at least tried to. George was part of this city's reality that many tried not to notice. But this time, Statham stopped. He didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to pay attention. "Hello," Statham said quietly, stepping closer. George raised his head and looked at him. His eyes showed no surprise or joy, only exhaustion, and an invisible wall he had built around himself to avoid the pain of every new rejection. "Hello," he replied, his voice soft and weary. "What do you want?" Statham paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. He was used to giving money, but today that didn't seem enough. I just wanted to talk," Statham said, looking at his face, which showed no sign of hope. George chuckled softly, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh full of disappointment and sadness. "Talk," he repeated, feeling some disbelief, but still holding onto a shadow of hope in his gaze. "And what are we going to talk about, Mr. Businessman?" Statham thought for a moment. He didn't know how to explain why he was standing in front of this man, but something in his voice made him, for a moment, feel less like a stranger. "About life," he replied, and it seemed utterly ridiculous. But George just shrugged, as if it was the least he could say. "Life," he repeated with a merciless tone. "It throws you away, Statham. And you don't care until you end up here, on the street, where all your ideas, money, and success mean nothing. You can't take them with you." Statham felt these words break through the shield he had tried so hard to build around himself. "Maybe you're right," he said softly, "but I want to understand how to help you. What can I do?" George fell silent for a moment. His eyes focused on Statham again, but this time with curiosity, not with prejudice. "Help?" he asked, his voice echoing the same disappointment. "How can you help someone who's already lost everything?" Statham looked at George, and in his heart there was a sense of misunderstanding. He didn't know what to say, but he was sure that even a small bit of help could change something important in this person's life. Statham stood silently, trying to find an answer that could somehow break the bitter silence that hung between them. George didn't look like he once had, and that fact troubled him. He seemed to carry all the pains of the past as a heavy burden. "I don't know how to help," Statham said, shrugging, "but I want to try." George merely shook his head, but still looked at him with curiosity, as if searching in his eyes for some sign that this wasn't just another offer from someone trying to buy their way out of guilt. "You can try," he finally replied, his tone slightly softer. "But don't expect me to tell you my story. It's not worth it." Statham threw his bag over his shoulder and sat down next to George, knowing that he couldn't just leave now without trying to understand why this man was on the street, why his life had become this way. George didn't speak about himself, but there was a certain strength in his words that made it impossible to just walk away. "I want to understand," Statham repeated, watching his reaction carefully. "Maybe you don't want to talk now, but if you could share even something, maybe it will change your view on the situation." George pressed his lips together, but opened up a little more than usual. He didn't answer immediately, but just stared at the dark sky above as if searching for some answers. "Once I had everything," he said slowly, with each word peeling back more of his memories. "A house, a family, a job. But then everything fell apart. If only I could go back to that moment when it all went wrong. I'd do things differently. But it's too late now. You can't turn back time." His voice cracked slightly, and in Statham's eyes, he saw the sad truth that even the best intentions can't always change the past. George didn't ask for sympathy, but he needed something more than that. "Were you married?" Statham asked, not sure why that particular question came to mind. George nodded briefly, but his gaze became more distant, as though he could already feel the pain from the memories of his past. "Yes, I was." He closed his eyes, briefly lost in thought. "My wife. Her name was Ellie. She was my world until one day she disappeared. No one could say where she went. I don't know if she ran away with someone or just decided to leave everything behind and start a new life. I was left alone with 3 kids. It broke me." Those few words said more than he had tried to express. Statham felt the depth of that loss, deeper than any material thing or business success. "I can't even imagine what it's like to lose everyone you love," Statham said quietly, feeling a wave of sympathy for George. George remained silent for a moment, then slowly added, "Sometimes I think it would have been better not to know anything. Because when you know what's waiting for you, it means you can't change the future. But what we can do now is make a choice. The thing is, even when you try to choose, you often end up face to face with what can't be changed." Statham remained silent, reflecting on his words. He realized that George needed help not in the form of money or material goods, but in feeling that there was still room for change in his life, even if it seemed impossible. "I want you to know, not everything in life is hopeless," he said. "Maybe it won't be easy, but it's not the end. And if you're ready, I'll try to help." George looked at him. It wasn't what he expected, but perhaps it was the only hope he had left. George remained silent for a long time, as if weighing every word. His eyes were full of doubts, but there was also a spark of hope in them that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know if it's worth starting over," he said, unexpectedly sighing. "Sometimes it feels like I don't have the strength anymore. And it's not just about the loss. It's about not being able to get back what was." Statham realized that George hadn't just gone through tough times, but he had lost touch with himself. He had forgotten who he really was and didn't know where to find the strength for a new beginning. "And if it doesn't start now, then when?" Statham replied, trying to find the right words. "Life doesn't give us many chances to go back, but maybe this is your chance. Maybe things aren't as bad as you think. I see that you're a real fighter, even if it's not always obvious. And maybe you have the strength to change it all, if you allow yourself." George shook his head, as though dismissing these words. But there was a different shadow in his gaze, not the same one as before. It was the shadow of a struggle, even if it was faint. "I don't know how to do it. What am I supposed to do?" Statham felt that this was the moment where he couldn't back down. He wasn't a psychologist, didn't have magical answers to every question, but he was ready to stand by him. And that was enough to give George a chance. "Let's do it together," Statham said, standing beside him. "Start small. The first thing you need to do is try to find yourself again. It won't be easy, and it will take time, but if you're ready, I'll be with you." George looked at him, as if in his words, he heard a truth he hadn't heard in a long time. He wasn't ready to believe completely, but that little spark of hope Statham gave him seemed worth trying for. The first step was always the hardest. "Maybe I'll try," he said, though still not fully sure of his resolve. "But if it doesn't work, I'll end up on the street again." "You won't be alone," Statham replied firmly, "and I'll be with you as I promised." The next few weeks were a trial for George. He started taking small steps, going to work, even started rewriting his resume, though without much optimism. Statham supported him, always checking in on how things were going and giving advice when needed. Sometimes George felt like all his efforts were in vain, but he still kept trying. And every day was an important step. One day, when Statham stopped by George's place to check on his progress, George was sitting in a cafe, looking at a letter. He looked different than before. For the first time in a long while, his face wasn't so heavy, and even his gaze seemed less distant. "How's it going?" Statham asked, sitting down beside him. George looked at him, and a small smile appeared on his face. "I found a job," he said, still not believing his own words. "It's not a big deal, but I'm starting to do something. And I feel like maybe this isn't the end. Maybe I can build something again." These words were the first real words of hope he had spoken in years. Statham smiled, seeing the changes that had taken place. "Well done, George. You've taken the first step, and that's already a big success." And although George wasn't yet ready to let go of his darker side, he felt that he could move forward, even if the road ahead would be difficult. And maybe, over time, he would truly be able to rediscover his true self. It was hard for George to believe that so much would change in just a few weeks. The job, although not the best, gave him a sense of stability. He woke up in the morning and went to work without the sense of hopelessness that had plagued him just a few months ago. Even the small moments, like talking to colleagues or having a cup of coffee after a long day, became enjoyable. But there was still something that troubled him. His new life seemed like a temporary trap that he had fallen into while searching for his place in the world. What would happen next? Would he go through the same chaos as before? The fear of being alone and helpless constantly reminded him of its presence. One evening, after work, George sat at home, looking through new job openings online. He didn't have much experience in the field he had applied for, but he tried to see at least a small chance for himself. At that moment, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Statham. "You're not alone, George. I know it's hard, but you've already come a long way. Remember, the important thing is to keep going. Don't run from what scares you, accept it, and it will become your strength." George sat for a few minutes with the phone in his hands, thinking. Statham was right. He was scared. He didn't know if he could handle all the challenges that still lay ahead. But it was better than staying in the place he had been just a few months ago. The next day, after another workday, George decided to go for a workout. He hadn't exercised in a long time, and although it wasn't his strong suit, he knew it would help clear his mind. He went to the local gym, which was not far from his house. Weightlifting, running on the treadmill, exercises on machines, he felt his body fill with energy, and his mind was cleared of worries. Each drop of sweat washed away the heavy thoughts that had once held him down. He hadn't become a superhero yet, but he felt like he was at least doing something good for himself. When the workout was over, George stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself. He looked the same as before, but there was no longer the self-destructive gaze he had often seen in himself before. He was ready to move forward. Maybe things weren't exactly how he had dreamed, but he was finally starting to feel like part of something bigger. A few weeks after that evening, George began receiving more job calls and felt his confidence growing. He wasn't searching for the perfect opportunity. He was just looking for new paths for himself. And although it was tough, he wasn't alone. One evening, when he and Statham were sitting in a cafe after another conversation, George said, I'm starting to think that all of this isn't a coincidence. I didn't just end up here by chance. I chose this path, and now I see that it might lead me somewhere." Statham smiled, proud that George was starting to realize his own strength. "You haven't found your peak yet, but you've already climbed. And that's important. You're already on your way to something big, even if it feels like a small step." George just nodded, feeling a new hope rising in his heart. He knew that tough times still lay ahead, but now he felt he wouldn't give up. And even when things got hard, he would be able to get through it, because now he had support, and he had become stronger than he was before. Step by step, George was rebuilding his life, finding more opportunities, and discovering new horizons. And although there were still many questions and uncertainties ahead, he was ready to embrace each new day, because now he knew that it was always possible to start over. Several months after that evening in the cafe, George had become a completely different person. He was no longer the one who doubted every step he took, who feared change and didn't believe in himself. Now he knew that even through hardships, he could move forward, and all he needed to do was keep going without looking back. His career was gradually gaining momentum, and although he hadn't quickly achieved everything he wanted, he felt like he was making the right moves. His work had become more stable, and his personal life calmer. He had made new friends, and his relationships with colleagues had grown stronger. And although the road to success had been tough, George was no longer ashamed of his mistakes because they had shaped him into who he had become. One day, walking past an old park, George stopped. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes, inhaling the fresh air. It had been a long time since he had been here last. He remembered sitting in the same spot, but back then he had felt lost and alone. Now he smiled, realizing that all his efforts, every new day, every struggle, were parts of the journey that had led him to this moment. And although life didn't promise him an easy path, he knew one thing. Now he was ready for any obstacle. Because it didn't matter how many times you fall, it only matters how many times you get back up. Looking back on all the difficult moments, George understood that true strength wasn't about being perfect or achieving all your goals, but about continuing to move forward, no matter what. Now he was ready for the next stage, for new challenges, because he had realized the most important thing. The road to success begins with the first step, and only you decide when to take it. And with a smile on his face, George continued his journey.